Okay, so I was working the cash register, right? I was waiting for time to go by, and then this one guy shows up. He has the dog food, and he puts it on the checkout table, and I'm trying to check him out as soon as possible because I'm not a fan of dealing with people. And then he just goes, "Kids your days don't know how to count." My math degree is crying in the corner right now, and I am so angry at this person. But I can't do anything or else I get fired. After I just check him out, he just kind of gets offended that I didn't laugh with him and leaves. I was so mad about this that I wanted to do something math related to prove that I was still smart. And that's how we got here. Savage Attacker, the feat in Baldur's Gate 3, which says, quote, "When making melee weapon attacks, you roll your damage dice twice and use the highest result." This sounds simple on paper, but it's a lot more nuanced than you think, as in this game you have dice with 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 sides, and in many instances you are rolling multiple dice at once. To begin, let me explain the thing that I went to school for: mathematics. More specifically, probability and statistics. Now, rolling any number on a dice is determined by 1 over s, where s is the total number of sides on the dice. For this discussion, S is going to vary depending on what weapon you're using. As a refresher, here is every weapon in the game and their dice. Sickles, light hammers, daggers, and clubs use a D4 damage dice. Hand axes, javelins, maces, scimitars, and short swords have a 6-sided damage dice. Tridents, quarterstaffs, and spears are the first set of weapons that can be wielded in 1 or 2 hands that uses a 6-sided dice and an 8-sided dice respectively. Great clubs, flails, morning stars, rapiers, and war picks all use an 8-sided damage dice. Battle axes, long swords, and warhammers all use a D8 when one-handed and a D10 when two-handed. Glaives, halberds, and pikes all use a 10-sided damage dice. Great axes are the only weapon that boasts a 12-sided damage dice. Great swords and mauls are the only weapons in the game that have 2 damage dice, both being a 6-sided dice. There are other sources of dice rolls for damage, but I'll get into that later. It's very easy to understand what the odds are when rolling a single dice. Every number has an equal chance of being rolled. Like with a 4-sided dice, each number has a 25% chance of being rolled. Then with a 10-sided die, every side has a 10% chance of being rolled. Rolling 2 die and taking the larger outcome is a bit more interesting. The first difference most people look at is the average number. For example, when rolling a 6-sided dice, the average number would be 3.5. You have an equal chance of getting more than that as you do less than that. When rolling 2 6-sided dice, you have 6 to the power of 2, or 36 outcomes. After a bit of calculation, you find that the average number becomes 4.47. That's almost an entire ability score improvement. However, there are 2 other patterns I want to point out. Firstly, in the charts that I made, you will notice the red square in the top left corner of all of them. They all contain the lowest half of the outcomes in the original dice. Basically, the half of the dice that was considered below average becomes less frequent. Instead of 50%, you have a 25% chance of rolling a below average number. Secondly, the highest number becomes the most common number. In fact, the odds of rolling the highest number are almost twice as likely as it was without Savage Attacker. This is the actual benefit of Savage Attacker: consistency. Yes, you do want to profit on damage compared to an ability score improvement, so only take it if your weapon is using an 8-sided dice at least. But this also comes at the benefit of getting mad at your dice much less often. Still following? Good. Earlier, I said that certain weapons roll 2 dice instead of 1. For 2 6-sided die, the damage will be a lot more consistent. Basically, lower risk, lower reward. Now, what happens if you throw Savage Attacker into the mix? Suddenly, now you have 4 dice instead of 2 that you are rolling. With 4 6-sided dice, that makes 1,296 outcomes. That's a big number. It took me an entire hour to make that spreadsheet. Keep in mind, this is not just the odds of 6-sided dice stacked on top of itself. No, you're rolling every damage dice twice and taking the highest result of each. Notice a few key differences. The odds of rolling two sixes go from 1 over 36, or 2.7%, becomes 9.3%. The odds of rolling the minimum is now less than 0.1%. And the most common number is not the max number like before. In this case, it's 9. Now, I want to bring attention to standard deviation. Standard deviation is a statistic that helps show how much data is spread out. I haven't talked about standard deviation yet, but it's a very important detail when it comes to statistics. For example, if you had a data set where the mean was 20, were those data points between 17 and 23, or were they between 0 and 40? Mean on its own can't tell us that. That's where standard deviation comes in. Standard deviation is calculated so that approximately 66% of the data points are within one standard deviation from the mean. 33% would be above the mean and approximately 33% below the mean. Two standard deviations contain approximately 96%. This means that 48% of the data points would be above the mean as well as below the mean. Anything outside of the second standard deviation only happens 4% of the time, on average. 2% of the time it will be 2 standard deviations above the mean, and 2% of the time it will be 2 standard deviations below the mean. The reason I'm bringing up standard deviation after talking about weapons that use 2 six-sided damage dice is because of how low its standard deviation is compared to the mean. Not only do these weapons have the highest average damage by default, both before and after Savage Attacker, but its standard deviation is lower than both the 10-sided dice and the 12-sided dice. Basically, the original mean was 7 damage, but now the mean is 8.8. However, since the medium is still 9, you will be getting 9 or higher over 50% of the time. Meanwhile, going off on what I mentioned earlier, the odds of getting 4 damage or less has only a 2% chance of happening with the Savage Attacker feat, as opposed to the 16.16% it was originally. This means greatswords and mauls benefit the most of any weapon in the game with the Savage Attacker feat, getting an effective 2 ability score improvements worse in damage. Now that we talked about what weapons this feat is good for, we can now talk about ways to make it stronger. See, Savage Attacker applies to every damage dice. You are probably wondering, where can I get more dice? Well, I have a list. The 8-sided and 10-sided superiority dice from the Battlemaster subclass, every form of smite from paladins or tieflings, the similarly named Savage Attacks ability that orcs get, certain clothing like the Dark Justiciar gauntlets or the Infernal gauntlets, dipping effects, and any additional dice rolled by certain weapons such as the Halberd of Vigilance or the Sword of Chaos. However, Savage Attacker's description is kind of misleading because it doesn't apply to every melee attack, like it says. For example, unarmed attacks do not get boosted. This also includes the monk's unique variants of it, such as Flurry of Blows. In addition, the sneak attacks that rogues get are also not affected. I understand the decision behind these. You are rolling a bunch of dice for those abilities, but I don't think it would have been too broken. And then paradoxically, throwing weapons that have the throw property does get affected. I'm pretty sure that when a weapon leaves your hand, it's no longer classified as melee, but whatever, it's still fun. Besides Tavern Brawler, it's probably one of the best feats you can give to a throw build. Overall, this feat does what any feat should do in this game, which is compete with ability score improvement. An ASI does more than just increase damage, but if you only care about damage, then Savage Attacker might be better if you're consistently attacking with an 8-sided dice or higher. Otherwise, there'd be no point. But hold on, we're not done. This is a good feat, and it's best on weapons with higher or more dice. Basically, weapons with 2 hands. There's a couple of problems with this because there's 2 other abilities in the game that simply overshadow the Savage Attacker feat. The Great Weapon Fighting Style and the Great Weapon Master feat. You want to talk about feats that increase your damage? Great Weapon Master is arguably the best feat in the entire game. If you score a critical hit, you can attack with your bonus action. And you gain a toggleable feature where you sacrifice 5 in your attack roll for 10 extra damage per hit. I mentioned attacks that work well with Savage Attacker, and I didn't mention attacks that hit multiple times, like Cleave for example. That's because both feats would apply to the same attack. Savage Attacker at its best will increase your average damage by 3 to 4, so you would need a lot more damage dice to match the damage given to you by Great Weapon Master. It's just a better option if you're solely looking for damage. That being said, Great Weapon Master comes with an accuracy debuff and a -5 to attack rolls, which is why it's usually paired with ways to increase your strength or dexterity, often in the form of other feats or potions. This makes Savage Attacker better when fighting enemies with high armor, such as bosses. Now, they can stack if you want to maximize damage, but you have a finite amount of feats in this game. Most builds only get 2 to 3, and that's not counting other feats you may want, like Ability Score Improvement, Alert, Sentinel, Polearm Master, etc. Justifying Savage Attacker is made even harder by the fighting style, which does something similar. The Great Weapon fighting style is a passive ability available to fighters and paladins, the two best classes for this feat. What it does is that if you roll a 1 or a 2 on your damage dice, the dice will get re-rolled, and this applies to all the same dice as Savage Attacker. It's a slightly weaker version as the dice you roll only gets re-rolled if it's a 1 or a 2. This means that rolling a 1 or a 2 has the same odds with either the feat or the fighting style. The larger the dice size, the more apparent the difference is, but most damage riders in the game are D4, where the odds of rolling both are practically the same. Even with Savage Attacker being objectively better, the fighting style does not waste a feat. Also, I bet some people are thinking, what about barbarians? They don't get a fighting style. That makes sense for a pure barbarian, but a 2-level dip in fighter for the fighting style does so much more for them than their level 11 and 12 abilities. If you want to completely remove low numbers from your life, then you can take both the fighting style and the Savage Attacker feat, in which case you get a very interesting interaction with each dice. Savage Attacker by default rolls 2 dice, but now if one of the dice rolled for Savage Attacker is a 1 or a 2, then that dice gets re-rolled. This will not apply to both dice rolls, as the fighting style only re-rolls each dice once. Even still, you have a total of 3 rolls per dice. Basically, you have made the minimum amount of damage borderline impossible. Like, hypothetically, let's say you attack with a greatsword. The first dice that you roll has a 1 in 3 chance of being 2 or lower. If that happens, then the fighting style activates, and you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting that again. Then the second dice from Savage Attacker gets rolled, and it does not get re-rolled if it's a 1 or a 2. With 3 dice rolls, the odds of that 6-sided dice being 1 or 2 is 1 in 27, or a 3.7% chance. However, you still have a second dice. Yeah, the odds of rolling both 6-sided die as a 2 or lower with the Great Weapon fighting style and the Savage Attacker feat is 1 in 729, 0.13%. With one of these abilities, the odds of getting 4 damage or lower was 2%. Now, it's 15 times as unlikely. Hello. I'm in the editing room, and I was double checking my math, and it turns out what I just said was factually incorrect. Going back to my sheet, what I said was correct until I added the second dice. When you roll the dice and to get 2 or lower, I assumed that that was the only way to get 4. Which is how I got the lower number. But I forgot to factor in that 3 plus 1 also makes 4. So this number is going to be slightly larger, but it's still going to be very minuscule. I just wanted to point that out because if I didn't, I would have been very sad. If you are planning to combine these abilities, then using the weapons that have 2 6-sided die is going to give you the biggest result, as the fighting style does not have the biggest effect on a 10-sided die or a 12-sided die. While Savage Attacker has the greatest effect on 2-handing weapons, it also has the most competition in that area. So, Savage Attacker gives the most benefit in a sweet spot between the six-sided die, where it's surpassed by ability score improvement, and the Great Weapon Fighting for reasons previously discussed. Luckily, there are plenty of builds that fill this group. For shield users, it can certainly be a good way to boost damage, especially since the shield makes up for the armor you could have gotten with an ability score improvement. Dual wielding has a strong argument for this because more attacks means more dice rolls, especially if you have a few of the damage modifiers listed earlier. Simply one-handing a weapon that can't be two-handed isn't exactly pointless because some abilities benefit from it, but if you're a monk doing this, they don't benefit from this feat on account of their abilities using unarmed attacks. And crit fishing builds can make use of this ability because getting a critical hit allows you to double all of your damage dice. Then you have Druid. Sweet mother of America, of all the classes that would utilize this feat, I did not expect it to be this one. First of all, Circle of the Moon Druids gain interaction at level 10, where Wild Shaping at level 10 grants you 4 Myrmidon forms, 3 of which wield weapons. Weapons where Savage Attacker can make a difference, and unlike Tavern Brawler, this actually works in Honor mode. Then you have the Spore Druid. At level 2, they gain an ability that gives them an additional 6-sided necrotic damage dice for a wild shape charge, and that damage doubles with Halo of Spores active. And last but absolutely not least, you have Druid's unique spell, Flame Blade. You can also get this with the Mephistopheles Tiefling, but Druids can use it to its fullest. This is a level 2 spell that summons a curved sword that does fire damage, but this doesn't function like a normal one that does a single d6 damage. This rolls 3 6-sided damage dice, with an additional 6-sided damage dice every 2 spell levels. If you don't know why a 5 6-sided die is actually cracked with this feat, you are not paying attention. Martial Druids are an extremely funny build, and everyone should try it at least once. In conclusion, Savage Attacker is an overall niche feat. Any melee build can make use of it. It won't always provide the best damage, but it will always keep your numbers from being too low. That is where Savage Attacker shines. Not just an increase in damage, but in the consistency for damage. Consistency in a game with so much luck can mean the difference between winning and losing a fight. And that's why I think Savage Attacker is a good feat and is worth trying. Okay, I hope that everyone who watched this enjoyed. I'm very happy I actually got that out of my system. And to everyone who actually did make it this far, I hope you guys have a good day.